Hello, I'm Robert Royal, and I'm the editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing, which is a daily column series that we put out every day, 365 days a year. And it's only 1,000 words. So, as many people discover when they discover The Catholic Thing, you can read it when you have your first cup of coffee in the morning. It isn't a long commitment of your time or your energy. I'd like to encourage anyone who hasn't already to subscribe to The Catholic Thing, which you can do for free. And when you do that, you will receive the daily column link in your email inbox at 6 o'clock every morning. And I'm sure you'll be glad that you do, because I myself enjoy reading our collection of writers who I think are some of the best writers and the best thinkers in the general Catholic tradition that we have today. So try it, and I'm sure that you'll be satisfied. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing, but I'm very happy to be here today with my longtime friend, Brad Miner, who is our senior editor. Brad is the author of a very interesting book called The Complete Gentleman, which is about what its title says. It's about being a man, being a good man, and being a gentleman, which is to say embodying the full values of what it means to be a male human being. But we're going to talk with Brad today because he's become kind of our informal in-house art critic and film critic. We're going to talk with him today a bit about what I'm calling beauty and art and religious experience, because there's been a lot of discussion in the church and in the culture as a whole lately about the role that beauty and artistic expression can play in the modern world, where we've kind of lost the sense of the transcendent, and people are not persuaded by arguments, but they are attracted by beautiful liturgies, by beautiful art, by poetry. And it all puts us, I think, in the right precinct to also experience possibly religious experience. So, Brad, it's great to be here with you. I'm really enjoying this, looking forward to enjoying this conversation with you. But let me just start out by saying this. A lot of people say beauty will save the world. Apparently, this is a phrase from Dostoevsky. I keep looking for it. And somebody the other day said that the actual quotation from Prince Mishkin in Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, is what he's asked the question, what type of beauty will actually save the world? I want to come back to that, but at the end, let's start at a
Okay.
more down to earth level. I'm just curious because you and I've known you for many years now, and I've known about your interest in the arts and in film. But I'm just curious of how you got interested in art yourself. I think our audience too would just like to know, how did Brad Miner find his way? You who have a long history in publishing, in book publishing, and magazines, etc. How did it appeal to you first?
I grew up in Ohio. My father was a professor at Ohio State, and he used to bring me with him sometimes on weekends when he had to go into the office, partly because I could go around the corner from the building where his office was and go bowling in the student union, but also because there were two museums chock-a-block to Haggerty Hall, where my dad had his office. One was called Orton Hall, which was a geological museum, and the other was the Ohio State Historical Society Museum. Now, neither was an art museum, but I fell in love with being inside these great buildings and looking at extraordinary things. I also loved doing art when I was a kid. I even had an art teacher who came to a party at our house. She was the wife of one of my father's colleagues. My dad was the chairman of the Department of Marketing and Business Administration at Ohio State, and so he would have parties frequently at our house, that building camaraderie in the department. And she looked at some of the art that was on the wall that my mother had put up that I had done in elementary school, and she said, "This kid has talent. You should get him art instruction." Well, my father wasn't having any of that. Jump ahead. Um, I'm in college. I go to Europe and I begin to go. I go to Paris, I go to Rome, I go to Florence, I go to Vienna, other places in between, and I go into all the art museums there and churches there. And I begin to get under my skin this wonderful sense I'd had when I was a little boy in the museums at Ohio State, but of something greater, more beautiful than anything I'd seen before. At the Uffizi, seeing my first Caravaggio face to face. I mean, that's the sort of thing that really creates indelible memories. So then I come back, I finish college. I've written about that, about becoming a Catholic. I wasn't a Catholic back in Ohio, but then I became one when I moved to California briefly. And I started haunting the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, which they now refer to by the reductionist initials LACMA, LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Everyone seems they have to condense beautiful names into these acronyms. Anyway, and then I came to New York and began working in publishing. And then is when I really became a museum rat. And I began not only visiting the Metropolitan Museum and the Frick and the Museum of Modern Art and the Cloisters and all the other museums that are here that we still, my wife and I, go to regularly. I mean, a month doesn't pass when we're not in one of those museums looking at some other aspect of it. And it
Let me
opened up this,
let me
yeah,
let me stop you there for a second, because
sure.
you mentioned New York, and I wanted to ask you about this because I know you see that there is a Caravaggio was one of the greatest religious painters of all time. He's one of your specialties, and of course, a lot of people think of him as the greatest, maybe the greatest Renaissance painter at least. How difficult is it? Because you must feel an affinity of the transcendence of the beauty, and on the one hand, and the transcendence of God on the other. How hard is it to pursue this in New York? I mean, isn't there a kind of a, I don't know if it's exactly anti-Catholic, but there certainly seems to be a much more kind of radical anti-traditionalist element in the art world around New York City.
No doubt about it. But you know what? One of the most Catholic institutions in New York City is the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Really?
Oh, yes. And not so much because the people there are Catholic or because they respect the faith, but because that museum is suffused with Catholicism. You walk into the Great Hall, and it's basically a church setting. That's where they put the Christmas tree every year.
Right.
Everywhere you go, you see Catholic art. If you took the Catholic art out of the Museum of Modern, out of the museum, the Metropolitan Museum, there would be no museum, or it'd be certainly a much, much smaller museum.
Right.
No, I mean, and it's certainly true of the cloisters. And the cloisters, as people may not know, I have written about it for the Catholic thing several times. It is a medieval monastery that was brought over and reconstructed on a hill overlooking the Hudson River north of the city, in northern Manhattan, in the Washington Heights area. It is magnificent. I mean, it is such a wonderful retreat. Steven Spielberg went there when he was filming West Side Story, doing the remake in 2016, to film the One Hand, One Heart duet with Tony and Maria, because he knew that it needed to be a Catholic setting for these two Catholic kids who were trying to make good lives out of the problems that they were having
Hmm.
in New York City. So, I mean, yeah, there is hostility to the faith. There's no doubt about it. But it's also the case you cannot escape the church. One of the places that almost every tourist who comes to New York goes is St. Patrick's Cathedral. And they go there, and when they enter in, no matter what they're bringing into it, whether they're Baptists or Jews or Muslims, they have that sense of awe that you get in a great cathedral. So my my thing is, I once, when I was a senior editor at a company called Bantam Books, I worked with a lot of different people. One of whom was a guy named Swami Satchidananda. He was a Hindu guy who did yoga, and he published a very popular book about yoga. And we had dinner one night together, along with some other people, including Peter Max and Alice Coltrane. And it was a very interesting evening. And he said, "What's it like being a Catholic in New York?" And I said, "Well, it's great. It's a New York. It's a Catholic town, really." He said, "Yes." He said, "Do you think it would be difficult to do yoga here?" And I said, "No difficult than it is to do Catholicism." And he actually did a spit take. He thought that was wonderful. He was sipping his tea and began to laugh. So, I mean, that's my point, Bob, you know, we are a strong and powerful faith, and
Uh,
nothing keeps us down.
yeah. So let me ask you a bit further, because you've been talking about this experience, like walking into St. Patrick's. If you don't mind being a little bit personal about this, how do you, in particular, kind of unite this idea of art and faith? I mean, when you're there, are you kind of an amphibian? You're feeling both things at once, or do you prepare yourself to go in and you read into what you're going to be seeing? I mean, I like to just walk in and see images. My wife loves to have audio guides or a human guide, and I like to just myself have a first impression, and then they can explain to me what other people have thought about it or what other people know about it. But tell me about your kind of approach to these.
Well, I think my approach is more like yours, less like Veronica's. I mean, afterwards, I'm liable to go to, say, the Metropolitan Museum's website, which is a very good website, some art museums, and I have several dozen of them on my desktop, links to the websites of the great museums around the world. The Met has really good descriptions of the work. Uh, the Prado in Madrid is better, and so you can get a lot of learning about it. But in my first encounter with art, and it isn't always the first encounter, it can be the second encounter or the third or the 10th of a particular work of art that I will go back to see time and again. I'll give you one example. At the Met, there is a Van Gogh painting of a pair of his own shoes. It's just called Shoes. And it moves me tremendously. The first time I saw it, it wasn't so much so. And then I began to read more about Van Gogh's life, which, as you know, is a tragic life. And his achievements were never much appreciated. And there's something forlorn and sorrowful about that image of just two shoes on a wooden floor. And yet, there's something transcendently spiritual and beautiful about it. So I like first to encounter, then to study. And the opportunity at the Met is endless because there's 640,000 works of art there.
Wow.
640,000. And it's one of the largest museums in the world. And of course, a great deal. Actually, they have more than that. They say 640,000. I think that's what's on exhibit. But they have more than 1 million pieces, a basement full of art. I did a piece for the Catholic thing called Hidden Art about how much you see in a museum it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
But the point is, encountering art, I think first you go with just your own personal reaction to it, what you see, those shoes. And then later, those shoes take on another meaning as you begin to study.
Yeah. I think people these days are really missing two things. They're missing art, and they're also missing creation. I mean, people are not outdoors enough. A lot of people get inspired. They see the beauty of God's creation, and it kind of, in an almost automatic way, it takes you up to a place where you feel that you absolutely, there has to be something beyond it that has produced this order and this beauty. And it's people who are spiritually starved and want to kind of climb out of this narrow world, this narrow materialistic world that we've created for ourselves, that I think when they encounter an image like that, or maybe something in nature, that it opens them up to something new. So I'm not surprised that even two shoes can be made, they can kind of connect you to the participation in the being, the great being that is God himself, if you're
Well, and especially to his creatures,
right.
us, the
Yeah.
people he created, our humanity. I
Yeah.
mean, that's one of the things about Van Gogh's work, just to mention one artist who wasn't Catholic. How many of the artists in the Metropolitan Museum are Catholic? I don't know, but it's a larger percent than
Pretty large percent.
anybody else.
Yeah.
But Van Gogh's suffering, Van Gogh's brilliance, his genius, because he was a genius. It's a different genius than Caravaggio's,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, and when I'm at the Museum of Modern Art, I always make a beeline to Starry Night, which they have. That's the great treasure
Oh,
of
yeah.
the Museum of Modern Art's collection. And you look at that, and I've come to realize and understand, reading about Van Gogh, that those swirls that are in the sky of the stars is maybe the way he actually saw it,
Yeah. Yeah. I've read that
because he
myself.
had problems with his brain, and he couldn't regulate those problems. Um, and all that humanity comes through. And of course, the great architecture of the cathedrals, which is a very important part of art. Tomorrow, we're going to be publishing a piece I've done about the construction of the two St. Peters in Rome, the one we know now and the one that preceded it. Those cathedrals, all throughout Europe, in the New World, were teaching tools. They were catechetical exercises in art. People were largely illiterate when they were built, but they could come into a place like St. Peter's or Notre Dame de Paris, and they could look around and they saw the faith as it was being explained to them in homilies as they were following along in the Mass, and it taught them about our faith
Yeah.
and what it means.
Yeah. This is another aspect of things that people kind of have become utilitarian and they just kind of think of buildings or buildings. And it was Churchill, I believe, who once said that we make our buildings and then our buildings make us. And so if you have beautiful buildings, I notice this too, when you go to schools these days that look like penitentiaries, or you go to a courthouse that looks, like a business office with a couple of cubicles. There's no sense of anything that's elevating to it. Whereas, I mean, obviously the medieval cathedrals are probably the most beautiful buildings that have ever been constructed
I think so.
in the world. I want to move on a little bit because you've also had a long interest in film, talking about the human element that exists in artwork. As you know, I'm not particularly a fan of film myself. My wife is, and she drags me to films, and sometimes I like them, and most of the time I don't find myself all that stimulated. But I get this sense because I like watching old films, which seem to have a thicker humanity to me. I think in literature too, we notice that there's a kind of a narrowing of what human beings seem to be like. Their preoccupations are much narrower than they were in the past, and these things were registered in our artworks, whether it's literature or film. What's your sense of the way that film was and is now? And what would you say to some Philistine like me who's not appreciating? Uh, I also think that in film, at least in American film, there are an awful lot of Italian Catholic people who are of Italian Catholic background who have contributed. I mean, you think of not just the directors, but actors like Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, I mean, and on and on and on. But set me straight, Brad, because I would really like to enjoy film more, but I seem to be missing something up here that I ought to have to understand it.
We were watching one of the uh, John Wick movies. You know about these movies?
Oh yeah, sure.
Keanu Reeves is the star. It's violence from beginning to end. And my wife said to me, "So, what do you think?" And I said, "I'm feeling nostalgic for the old production code because there's the humanity has been bled out of these things. We have this passion for sex and violence in motion pictures these days. Now, those are not the kind of films that I review for the Catholic thing. And I'll say this about movies. I love art and architecture. I love poetry, novels, nonfiction books, the Bible. God knows I love the Bible. But the highest art form is probably the motion picture for the simple reason that it contains everything. It's got writing, it's got people acting, it's got visuals that are stunning. I mean, it can do more than almost any other medium. Now, whether it does it as well as those other mediums is what the issue of reviewing is all about. And it's sad how infrequently these days filmmakers who are addressing Catholic subjects, for instance, get the church right. As a rule, they simply don't. And it's because they're looking for that other thing, the John Wick part, the thrill, the shock, the scandal. And I understand that, and those things are a part of life. So I'm not opposed to addressing them. Some of the great Catholic filmmakers like John Ford and others addressed those issues back in the day when they were making films. But I do love films because there's nothing that can transport you and make you, I think, feel emotion more powerfully than film. And emotion ought to be a part of it.
So, what films, just to kind of lay out some touchstones, what films in particular would you recommend to the people who typically are part of the Catholic thing audience?
Well, I must say I have to go back to, well, I mean, I've been thinking a lot lately. I guess I'll jump in this way about the Passion of the Christ, because as you know, Mel Gibson's about to do the sequel. You know, he's ginning up all his energy and the money to get to Rome, to work in the studios there and in other places around Italy. And he's going to bring Jim Caviezel back out of the tomb, and 20 plus years later. And it's going to be an interesting exercise to see how he manages to bridge those 3 days over the course of 20 years elapsed since the making of the first film. And apparently, it's going to be a bit more inventive, because I think he's going to do not just the resurrection, which we would expect. We'll see how the shroud was made, I bet. And I think also we're going to see the descent into hell, the herring of hell. And Mel has even, I think, used the word, possibly in an interview with Raymond Arroyo, as being a little psychedelic,
Hmm.
which just goes to show you that even a great filmmaker like Mel Gibson, and I think he is a great filmmaker. I very much enjoyed his film about the conscientious objector who went to war in World War II and won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he's done other things that have been extraordinary. But as far as Catholic films that are out that you could see now, I think I have little to recommend of contemporary Catholic filmmaking, partly because there aren't that many actual Catholic filmmakers working today, for whom the church and its glory are the point. But you go back to Going My Way and The Bells of St. Mary's and the Quiet Man and other films that portray the moral dimension of the faith. And I think those are the films that can restore your faith in what filmmaking can be. But I also believe that we got to take the good with the bad. And I mean, there would be no point for me to review movies, nor would there be much for me to do if I were only reviewing great films, because there are just not that many of them made. And of course, we we can disagree. I mean, I know that there have been films that I've reviewed that other people think are great and I haven't liked. And I guess I have a sort of a reputation when it comes to reviewing films that I don't have with regard to reviewing art, because I generally only review the art I love,
Yeah.
and the artists I admire. But I got to go after other movies because those are more contemporary. Those are the things that are pressing upon us now. And much of it just isn't as good as it would have been 50 years ago.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually that influential either. You and I have talked about this a bit before, but there was a time when some of these blockbuster films really just kind of dominated the culture, whereas these days, even a fairly good religious film, I don't know that it would, it would have all that much impact. I don't think I've ever told you this, but my one foray into film criticism is I was asked by an Italian magazine. One of my books was translated into Italian, and the publishing house had a magazine, and they asked me when the Passion of the Christ came out to go to the film preview and write about it for them. So I went here in Washington, D.C., and all these people who were there were not exactly the kind of people I normally hang out with. They're all chattering, and it's very clear that they're all into, kind of liberal politics and cultural stuff. And, they're just enjoying themselves socially before the film comes on. And then it came on, and we all watched it for the 2 hours, however long it was. And when it was over, there was dead silence in that room. I mean, people, I think, were just utterly shocked because they probably kind of just took for granted the idea of the scourging at the pillar and the crown of thorns and the crucifixion. It's just, yeah, that's that Christian story. You read about it in the Bible. But when they saw it actually represented, it was like, wow. And then, of
Yeah.
course, later on, people came along and said, "Oh no, it was too violent," and that's Mel being Mad Max, Mel and whatnot.
Right.
I remember that one time in that film following crowd, that boy, they had really seen something that shook them up. Brad, we're coming sort of to the end of our time, but let me just, we started out with this idea of beauty saving the world, and I never know what that means. And I'm a student of Dante's, and I never, like you, I'm never horrified when Catholics actually look at the negativity in life. I always tell people that before Dante gets to paradise, 2/3 of his poem is about sin and redemption from sin, and then he starts, to experience heaven. So a lot of what anybody who's a faithful artist, in the sense of being faithful both to God and to the human experience, is going to have some mixed things in there. But do you have any final thoughts, since we started with this idea of, maybe some form of beauty might save the world? A lot of beauty, I think, wrecks the world because people don't know what to do with the beauty, or they get seduced by the wrong type of beauty. Have you reflected on that phrase at all?
When you proposed that we talk about this, I started reflecting on it. Um, Beauty saves the world because beauty saves us. Our faith is beautiful. I was thinking, particularly to get into the context of a specific work of art. We featured this on the Catholic thing once or twice. Leonardo da Vinci, not the greatest artist in my view who ever lived, but one of the greatest people who ever lived, one of the smartest, did a sketch of the face of Our Lady, of the Mother of Jesus, that is, to me, as transcendently beautiful as anything I've ever looked at. Maybe when we post this at the Catholic thing, we'll put that image in beneath the text that introduces our little conversation. Her beauty is the kind of beauty that we seek. Heaven is a beautiful place. As we pursue beauty, as we look at beautiful things, as we try to think beautiful thoughts, we are transformed by beauty. And because we're transformed by beauty, there is that opportunity to transform the world. But that's the only way it can, because unless the beauty in art and in the world, in nature, unless that transforms us, gives us deep appreciation of it, and the source of that beauty, well, beauty becomes sterile. And part of the reason that we see so much ugliness in art, in film, is because there is a kind of satanic thing at work where people want to reject what's true and beautiful, and that we have to fight against. And I'll give Mel Gibson credit for this. He's an angry guy. I'll just say it, and you can see that to some extent in the work he does. But I also think he believes in the true and the beautiful. So I'm hopeful that the resurrection of the Christ will be a beautiful film.
Oh, good. Thank you, Brad. Well, this has been very interesting, very enlightening. As many years as I've known you, I've actually learned a bunch of new things about you, and I thank you for being candid with us about your experience. And
Don't fire me.
I'm not firing you. You are our resident film critic and art critic, and until you go to meet your maker, that's what you're going to be doing for the Catholic. I can guarantee you that. Thanks for that, and thank you all for listening to us or watching us on this podcast. Let me just say again, please, if you enjoyed this, or if you enjoyed any of our podcasts or our writing, please subscribe to the Catholic Thing. You can do it for free. We welcome donations, and these donations are tax deductible. But we're engaged in trying to put the Catholic Thing, which is to say this great heritage that we have, that is not only of philosophy and theology, but also, as we've been talking about today, art and architecture, music. We've got a heritage that has no parallel, that's alive in the world today, and we ought to value it. So that's what we're trying to bring to you. We hope you appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you here again next time.